everybody, welcome to the show. Hello everyone, welcome back to Raising AZ, this YouTube channel all about homeschooling. My name is Amanda and I am a certified teacher. I am certified to teach elementary school, kindergarten through grade 6. I've taught in the public school system, I've taught in the private school system, and I ultimately ended up deciding to homeschool my kids. Why is that important? Because one of the biggest things I hear from parents who want to homeschool their kids is that they never went to teachers college and they don't feel like they were qualified to teach their kids. That somehow because they don't have a teaching degree, they don't know and they aren't capable of educating their kids at home. And I want to tell you, as a teacher, as someone who did teachers college, who went to school to learn how to teach people, it really wasn't that important when it came to homeschooling. It really isn't. And I'm going to tell you all about that today. But before that, if you are new to homeschooling, if you have questions about how to get started, if you're wanting to get started and you get inspired by this video and you want to take that jump, I highly recommend you check out this book, How to Start Homeschooling When You Have No Idea Where to Start. I wrote it to help parents get started when it comes to homeschooling. It has everything you need to like jump in and get started, and it's all in one place, which is my point in writing it. So this, I'll put a link down below. It is available on Amazon and it is a great resource if you are brand new to homeschooling. What is it like to go to teachers college? I think people need to know that, because I think a lot of people think that we're sitting in these classrooms and we're learning this like very educational, inspirational, there's a lot of like tips and tricks that we're learning, very detailed lessons on how to do things and how to teach kids to read and how to teach them how to do things. And it's really not that. I think there's a really big disconnect between what people think happens in teachers college and what actually happens in teachers college. And once you kind of learn what it's like to be in teachers college, you realize why it's really not necessary. What kind of education do I have? I have a 4-year honors bachelor degree with a history major, English minor. That's what I did at a university here in Ontario. And then we in Ontario have the option of doing your teacher's college 2 ways. You had the option of doing your 4-year honors bachelor degree. You could do a 3-year, but you had to get an undergraduate degree, and then you applied and went into teacher's college, and it was a 1-year intensive program. And in that 1 year you did all of your placements, all of the classes you needed required by the accreditation to become a teacher. Or you could do it as concurrent ed. So that's what I did. So basically, as I was doing my undergrad, I had to take, I think it was 3 extra courses that were specific to education. So instead of taking those in your final year, you took them throughout your undergraduate, and we did 3 extra placements. That was a great thing because I got to try out different classrooms, and I thought I wanted to be a high school teacher, and I learned really quick that was not my thing. And so I switched down to elementary school and really realized I enjoyed that much more. So I had those placements where you went into the class and basically you were a teacher's helper. You were there to help. You were not teaching at all, really. You were just there to assist the teacher and observe and see how they're doing things, why they're doing things. They would talk to you and explain like, this is why I did this, or this is going to be a great assignment that we're going to do because of this. This is how I'm going to grade it. So really it was a lot of observation. And we had to do 40 hours of observation for each placement. So I think it was like 3 placements. And then the final year, you went into a full year program that we had to do and during that year, we had 2 more placements. And that teacher's college experience, I asked my husband, because he did consecutive, I did concurrent. We're both teachers. I said, is this how your program was like? And we discussed it, and he was like, yep. Despite him being in the senior high school kind of program, me doing elementary school, despite it being concurrent and consecutive, we had very similar experiences as to what teachers college was like. And I think this is going to be like, I think it's mind-blowing. So basically, teachers college is a very weird place. It's a weird place because you have these classes on things like ethics and law around school, but then you also have subject specific classes. So we had a math class, we had a science class, music, art, phys ed and computers and literacy. Those were like our subject specific classes. And it was weird because when you were in those subject specific classes, it was as if you were a child again. So basically we would like go into these classes and it was like as if I was 5 years old again. So in science class, we would sit around and the teacher would give us like a paper and we would do a science experiment similar to what you would do in a first or second grade class. We would, you know, like fill test tubes with different things or like do different activities. We went on a field trip to a local kids science center as adults, as a group of like, the youngest of us was 21. And we all went to the local science center because it was a field trip and we needed to see what science activities could look like from a class's perspective. Okay, we would go to art class and the teacher would hand us like watercolors and she'd be like, okay, here are some watercolor techniques. And she would do it on the board, on her easel or whatever. And then she goes, and now you try. And we would spend the rest of the next hour painting fruit with watercolor. And then we got graded on it. Now, being honest, our artwork was pass-fail. So either you did it or you didn't. But like, that was our activity. That was our lesson was, here's how to paint with some watercolors. Here's the lesson. And now you're going to do it for the next hour. And at the end of the class, we had to like let it dry. And then we had to submit a portfolio. Like that was our entire grade for the class. In music class, we would learn to sing little ditties and songs. We had entire classes devoted to playing boom whackers, which are like tubes that you hit on the floor and it makes different notes. Like that's what we did was like, okay, we're going to learn how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb with some boom whackers today. And that's what we would do. In literacy class, I think this is like the funniest thing. So again, the youngest of my class of 30, I think there's 36 of us. I was one of 3 classes. So there was my elementary K through 6, and then there's 2 4 through grade 10 levels of students. And so my class, there was 36 of us. And so again, the youngest of us is 21. And we would all sit on the floor on the carpet in one of the rooms. And we would take turns, one of us being the teacher, and we would read a picture book, like any of these that you see behind me, like a picture book. We would pick them up and we would read them to each other. And we would practice reading them so that everyone could hear us reading loudly to a class of 35 other students. And we would like show the pictures. But like for the rest of us, we were sitting there listening to stories, listening to the Gruffalo, listening to the Very Hungry Caterpillar, listening to the Chrysanthemum, like listening to like classic children's books. This is what we did. And we did it every week. We would sit on the carpet and spend a section of the day reading picture books to each other. And the rest of us felt like we were 5 years old. It was a very strange thing. My husband and I we discuss it. We don't understand why. We don't understand what the point of us being kids was. Because it wasn't, I found often it wasn't like the teachers were they would like do a lesson and then explain why they did it. Very rarely was that the case. It was like, here's a lesson of something that might happen that you might have to teach at one point. I'm just going to do it for you, and then you can just learn from watching me do it. It was a strange experience. But I think the most important part of this whole thing was that there was no like direct instruction on how to teach something. So a lot of parents, I think that teachers have like, again, a class on like how to teach children to read, how to teach kids to multiply. And you would think, in theory, like that's a very good assumption. You'd assume that teachers had a class on how to teach kids to read. There's no class like that. There is no instruction on how to teach kids to read because there's not really one specific surefire path to getting kids to read. That is something we learned in our classes in our undergraduate, which were more on like educational psychology and like the history of education. We did a whole class on the history of education. But those were like, that's more of what we were taught, was that there isn't one way to teach this. There isn't a surefire way to do this. And so we're just going to read picture books, and kids, that's what we're going to do, because reading to kids is the best way for them to learn how to read. So that's what we did. And I think that's a really shocking thing for a lot of parents to understand, is that there was not a lot of direct instruction on how to teach something specifically. Now, that's not to say we didn't learn a lot of things when we were in Teachers College. So some of the things that we did, for example, when we would read those picture books, when it was your turn, for example, I picked up a book, I would read it to the class, and for each book, for the book that I had, I would come up with like 2 or 3 activities that I could do using that book. And so I would have the book, and part of the assignment was I had to do like a 1-page write-up on like a quick summary of what the book was about, and then include, like I said, 2 or 3 activities I could do with it. That was the assignment that went with the reading the book out loud. And we would drop all of them into like a Dropbox type of folder, and then we could each download the lessons. So when I left Teachers College, I think I had 36 picture books, and I had at least 2 to 3 activities that went with each of those picture books, which is a very helpful resource. I'm not gonna lie. That was a fantastic resource because people did a lot of the work for you. But it was not specifically how to teach kids to read. I think the point that I got the most out of these like subject specific classes was to share resources. And that was a kind of a really interesting, looking back, that was kind of like the whole point. Is so we would do a lot of like activities where we would teach kind of one activity, or we come up with one math activity or one science activity, and we'd write up a whole like lesson plan on how you would do it, and then we would share with the class. And so we would print off all these activities, and we kept them in like folders and binders and stuff. And that was kind of a really great resource. And I think that the whole point of that was to teach teachers to share resources, to share ideas, to collaborate together, and to, work together to educate children in general. And it is a great idea. Did I really need to go to Teachers College to learn that though? No. Can you as a homeschooler learn that? Yes. Nowadays, in the age of like Pinterest, Google, Facebook, like there are so many, Instagram, TikTok, like there's so many different platforms and places where you can get ideas, you can get curriculums, you can get unit studies, you can ask entire Facebook groups where people just share like, hey, this is what we did with my kid today. It was super cool if you want to try it out. Like there's so much information sharing and resource sharing that can happen even within the homeschool community that you really don't need a teaching degree to do that. And maybe it was a bigger deal back when I was in Teachers College because Pinterest was just starting. Like I was back in the early stages of Pinterest when I was in Teachers College. And back then you couldn't just join Pinterest. You couldn't even just search Pinterest. You had to actually have a login, and you had to be invited by somebody who was already on Pinterest. And so I remember one day, that's what I did, was I just invited anybody who wanted to be on Pinterest onto Pinterest because it was a phenomenal resource and no one was using it yet. But now everyone can be on Pinterest, and anyone can look at Pinterest, and anyone can Google activities. And so that aspect of needing to share resources like that is not as in demand. It's still a great skill, and it's a great way to make connections and to help people and to help yourself and make your jobs easier. But is it necessary to go to school to learn to do that? No. So why was this focus on doing so many activities? Why were we doing this? The other reason I think we had a big focus on doing these activities and kind of filling our teacher bag, so to speak, with resources is in our area where we live, there's a very large amount of supply work. So typically when you become a teacher, if you want to stay kind of in our area, because we have 2 teachers colleges within an hour of each other, if you want to work in one of the 4 boards in our area, typically you're looking at being on the supply list for anywhere from 3 to 8 years. And that means being called in last minute to multiple grades possibly. And so you needed to be able to be prepared to teach anything. So I understand that part of it. So we had to be able to walk into a classroom and be like, oh, here's a grade 3 class. The teacher had to leave immediately. She started vomiting everywhere. You now need to teach a class. She has no lessons planned. Not that that happens very often, but that was kind of the thing that we were you need to be ready, because you could walk into a situation where there is no lessons planned, where there's been an emergency, where something's come up and you need to just fill the day. and you don't know who you have, what the situation is, and you just need to be ready to go. And so by having this kind of like collection of resources, we were ready essentially to be able to do something. So I could pull out one of my 6 picture books that I kept in my bag, and I had 3 activities that could go with any of those 6 books. So that meant I had like 18 possible read aloud and activity that I could just do on the drop of a hat. I had a whole series of math games that I could pull out and work on a math skill with these students easily, regardless of age level that I was in there to teach. So I think that was one of the big things that we needed to do, and that's why we were kind of educated in that system, in that kind of way. But is that necessary when you're homeschooling? No, because you only have your kids. Like, no one, you're not going to wake up tomorrow and have a random, 6th grader with your kindergartner, because that doesn't happen. Now, you might have to babysit somebody. Like, for example, I might be called to babysit one of my nieces or nephews, but like, it doesn't really affect my day. We could either take the day off if something came up, or they could join in, or they could just play while my kids did their schoolwork for the day. Like, it's not, I wouldn't be now trying to figure out how to do an activity for this kid who's not my kid, right? Like, you don't really do supply work as a homeschooling parent. And so that's kind of a moot point when you become homeschoolers. You don't have to be that prepared. Now, is it nice to have those activities and those ideas? Yes. Do I have that list of picture books because most of them were pretty fantastic? Yes. Do I own several of them? Yes, I do. But is it necessary? Like, are you getting that much value as a homeschooler out of that teaching degree? No. Now, there was a class that was super practical, and it was super great as a teacher. We had it twice a week compared to the other classes that we had once a week. And this class was called Methods. We loved Methods because we had a phenomenal teacher. Her name was Pam. She was this little spunky Indigenous woman, and she was an educational consultant. And basically, she was this wonderful, idealistic, holistic, educational woman. And she had so many things going on for her. But like, basically, the biggest point of what she was trying to teach us in this methods class, which you would think would be like the methods of like the methodology of teaching to read, or methodology of how to teach kids to add or multiply. No, that wasn't the point. Methods was predominantly, like 95% of that class was about systems. And it was about the systems of figuring out your lesson plans. It was the systems that you would use to set up your classroom. It was the systems you would use to do the basic procedures that had to happen throughout your day. Those were the things that you learned in methods class. So what I mean by that, as a teacher, it was super helpful because it was things like, how do you handle kids having to go to the bathroom? Because you want kids to have their autonomy and they shouldn't have to ask, but then you have to also know where all your students are all the time. But then is it embarrassing if they have to write down things? Like, there's a lot of like questions like that. That's the kind of thing that we would discuss and kind of have options and plans and things like that happen in our class. So that's the kind of things that we would do. And it'd be like how to set up turning your work in and having work in and work out. How would you set up kids who work for kids who were not there that day and had to pick up their work that they missed? How would you set up your classroom to have supplies for everybody so that it's equitable for the kids who forgot their stuff, but also kids who just can't afford things? Like, how do you set up your room in a way that is the best for everybody? So as a teacher in a classroom, potentially of up to 30 plus kids, very good information. And understanding the psychology behind the reason why you might do something some way and why you might have certain procedures for certain things, super great. We also did a lot of attention grabbers, which is always a fantastic thing. And it is something that I have used multiple times. I've run day camps, I've done youth groups, and it's always shocking to people that I can pick up the attention of like 80 kids in under 30 seconds. It's a fantastic skill. It does need a group setting though, number one, I'll tell you that. But that doesn't really relate to homeschooling. I don't need a bathroom procedure for my kids to go to the bathroom. They can just go because there's 2 of them. Like, just go. I didn't need a class to tell me to keep a box of pencils in a pencil case in our homeschooling space. Like, that's just common sense, right? as a homeschooling parent, those are just things that you would do, right? They're just things you know, they're things you would do. And it doesn't really matter because it's your own home, your own space. You can set it up and rearrange it how you want, and you're not worrying about inequities and those kinds of things because it's your space. And if your kid has to go to the bathroom, you just let them go to the bathroom. And then you just wait the 5 minutes and then you just keep going with whatever you're doing. Like, it doesn't affect your flow of your day that significantly as it does when you have to manage the bathroom habits of 30 kindergartners, right? But back to Pam. Pam was a very interesting woman. And there, like, a lot of what Pam talked about was great. For example, she talked a lot about, like, kids have short attention spans. And typically in schools, we are overly focused on having kids do long amounts of seat work. There's too much emphasis on seat work. There's not enough emphasis on creativity and movement. And we ask kids to pay attention for far too long. That was a big part of what she was talking about in methods class. But again, we were students. And so we were treated like we were 5 years old. And so we had to constantly move. I left methods class exhausted because it was a 2-hour class and we never did the same activity for more than 15 minutes. So we would all go to the carpet. We'd sit there. We'd discuss what we're going to do today. We should get us all set up. And then we had to get up and we had to like skip to our chairs. Not even kidding. Skip to our chairs and we'd sit down. We'd like spend 15 minutes working on like the group aspect of what we were doing for that day. Usually it was like a group project kind of discussion thing. And then for 15 minutes would be up. We'd have to stand up. We'd have to spin around. We'd have to do this like little weird cheer thing. Then we'd sit down. Then we would discuss it as a group. Then we had to stand up 15 minutes later, go back to the circle, have our time, have a discussion there. 15 minutes later, we were going back to it for 2 hours, twice a week. It was exhausting. But like this was supposed to like train us to like understand that this is the attention spans of children. And so she wanted us constantly moving and constantly doing things. And she was very idealistic, which was really, really nice. I had a lot of teachers in Teachers College who were fantastic teachers, but I did find them, because they were into like the realm of educational consultants, a lot of them I found were super idealistic. And that was great for them. But it was just, I found a lot of what they were wanting us to do in a classroom was just not practical. It was not practical in the groups and the typical class sizes that you're getting. Yes, you might be able to do some of these things, like for example, having this much movement in a class of 12 kids would be great. The up and down, turning around, all that, great in a classroom of like 20 kids, maybe. But when you're starting to get into like the routines of like, okay, now you have 30 kids, 32 kids, they're under the age of 5, you have to do all of these things. That's a lot of movement. It's a lot of transitioning, and a lot of the younger kids have a hard time with transitioning. We're also not taking into the fact, the neurodiversities and the behavioral issues and, the traumas that a lot of these kids are going through, that make transitioning really hard. And so like, it was this very idealistic thing that like, yes, kids have short attention spans, and yes, they need a lot of movement and they need a lot of creativity. It was just really impractical. Let me give you an example. So during one of my placements, I had to do my placement, do a lesson for the class that I was teaching, and one of the teachers from the university would come and like observe you and give you feedback and that kind of stuff. And I had Pam, I had my methods teacher, she was my placement supervisor, and she came and watched my lesson. Whew, was this an interesting lesson? So because of knowing that Pam was coming, I tried to include more movement, more creativity, a lot of like expressionism into my science class that I was teaching. But the thing was, the teacher I had was not into any of these ideas. She was a veteran teacher. She was like, this is how it is. This is how we maintain order and discipline in this class. This is how we get through everything we need to get through. We have very high standards for EQAO, so we're constantly working on test taking. We're constantly working on literacy and math. We're constantly doing like these things, getting ready to take EQAO, getting ready to do all these things. And so the class was interesting because when I taught, and I would incorporate more of these like idealistic ideas, it was absolute chaos because there was just so many kids. And they also weren't used to having any form of like this kind of like more freedom, because it was just not practical for this teacher to get through everything she had to do if there was this much movement and this much wildness. But because I was doing my placement, we were going to try this lesson, and I tried to find a happy medium. So I had an activity that was very interactive. We were going to use a smart board, which was like this board that was like a touch screen that the kids can move things around. And we were learning about habitats. And so we did the lesson. And Pam was observing, I have my class, the teacher was there. And as soon as I started transitioning these kids from one seat activity into like coming up and moving things on the board and trying to make things more interactive, the whole room just went berserk. I had kids who were making animal sounds. So whenever I put an animal on the board and we tried to talk about like what kind of habitat do we think this animal lives in and why, instantly the entire class would start making whatever that animal noise was. They hooted, they mooed, they cawed, they howled at the moon. And then at one point I had one kid who stood up and decided he was gonna like flap his arms like a bird, and it was just like, it was wild. We got through it, but like when I left the room, my placement teacher gave them crap, and then I went in there and I was just like, that was so exhausting and so stressful, and I was so not impressed with because we didn't get through everything. We had a hard time getting everybody back under control and back into like getting into the activity and the worksheet that we had to do and all of that. I went to have my meeting with Pam, and I was a little nervous because from everything I had seen, this being like my 4th placement, that was wild. Like having been in multiple classrooms at this point and seeing that, I was like, this was just wild. And so I sat down and I looked at Pam, and she looked at me and she went, that was amazing. That was so great that you had so much movement. The kids felt so free to express themselves with all those animal sounds. Like that just made my heart so happy. And I love that you incorporated all of their, like the flapping, like she loved the whole bit. And so she finished my lesson. We finished my little discussion. She left. We still had like an hour and a half in the rest of the day, the school day. I don't think we got through anything for the rest of the school day because the kids were so riled up from mooing. And that's the honest truth. Like it was just, when you have that many kids and they're feeding off of each other and transitioning that often, it's just not practical. But it's really idealistic. And it's really nice that it's idealistic what she was talking about, but it's just not practical in the classroom setting, in the system that we have now. Now, if we had a different educational system, and I have seen these in, different schools and alternative schools and stuff, maybe it would work. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but I'm saying in the traditional classroom settings that we have now, it's just not practical. But there was an interesting thing that came out of this idealism, because she wasn't the only idealist. I had my literacy professor at one point. He was a fantastic literacy professor. But at the time, he and I butted heads a lot, not in a bad way. I'm just like, I just don't understand how this works, because he was very much an idealist. And he was, again, another educational consultant. He had worked in classrooms, but interestingly enough, he was a homeschooler himself. So his kids were homeschooled, and they were radically unschooled. So they didn't do very much curriculum at all, if any, unless the kids specifically were working towards a topic. He was instrumental in implementing play-based learning and inquiry-based learning across Ontario in kindergarten classrooms. He was a big advocate for this play-based, inquiry-based, letting kids' interests and passions lead their learning. This was his thing. This is what he has PhD in. This is this incredible idealistic idea of what education could be. And so it was an interesting thing, because I was like, this is not practical in a classroom setting. In the traditional classroom settings that we're seeing nowadays, it's just not practical. It's just not practical. And he and I was just like, I just don't see this working in classroom. And on my last placement, I ended up in this French kindergarten class. And by sheer coincidence, the placement teacher that I had was getting ready to do a play-based, inquiry-based classroom the following year. And she was in a mini professional development pod with my literacy professor, and he was leading it, and he had teachers from all over the board in our area coming to learn how to do these like inquiry-based classrooms and testing it out in their class. And so I had to do this in a classroom setting. So I've tried this. It was the most draining experience of my life because there was no way to plan and to prepare anything when you're following the inquiries and the ideas of 30 children. It was impossible to follow the interests of 30 kids across the board and have it be graded in a way that made sense. We never knew what we were going to do the next day. Like, you could not lesson plan with this system because literally I had to lesson plan. That this was a frustration as a teaching student. I had to lesson plan, and I had to do like a weeks at a time. And every lesson plan, if you don't know this, when a teacher does a lesson plan, like a true lesson plan, not like making notes of like, okay, we're going to do this in our book or whatever. A true lesson plan for each subject is often 4 to 8 pages long. And it goes through all of the requirements, all of the curriculum expectations, how they're going to diversify it for each individual learner who has any kind of accommodation that needs to be met, what the activity is, how each step of that activity is going to be diversified. It's a whole thing. So as a student who had to write these for every single lesson I taught, and I was teaching 75 to 100% of the day at this point, it was impossible to do anything ahead of time because at the end of the day, we would have to sit down for 2 hours after the day ended and discuss what we were going to do the next day because everything we had planned for the whole week was up in smoke because the kids found something else they were interested in that day. And now we had to follow what they were interested in. And everything I had planned for the whole week was gone. I had to now redo all my plans for the next day. And there was a 50-50 chance we wouldn't get through them because if the kids weren't interested in the morning, we probably wouldn't get to them because we had to follow their interests. It was exhausting because that was just like her and I planning. I then had to come home and write all the lesson plans up. Okay? It was exhausting because how do you have nowhere where you're going. And then having been in like a private school, it's exhausting trying to get kids to do science fair and do an experiment and do something that they're interested on one subject. When you're doing these inquiry-based learning and these interest-based learning projects, it's multidisciplinary. So it was like, it's absolutely chaotic. Teaching the science fair projects was exhausting enough. But when you're adding in, like I said, multidisciplinary across the boards, how do you grade that on a curriculum that's set by the government? Like, how do you grade this kid learned this and they learned how to add, but this one was learning how to do geometry and this one was learning how to do some probability with these dice. But then we also we're talking about they're learning different aspects of the literacy curriculum. So they're learning about nouns, they're learning about adjectives, they're learning about writing, short stories. They're doing rhythm and rhyme and poetry. It's so chaotic when you're following this many kids' interests that it's nearly impossible for 1 or 2 people to do it. You can't. And that's before you take into consideration neurodiversity, learning disabilities, behavioral issues, poverty, trauma. Before you do that, it's just because you can't reach that many kids all at the same time. You are only one human being. And I was like, this just doesn't work. And I remember telling this professor, his name was Jeff. I was like, Jeff, it doesn't work. And he's like, it does work. He's like, I've seen it work. And I said, I don't know where you've seen this work. I do now. This is probably the one incredible thing that came out of Teachers College was that I got to see what idealistic learning could look like. And I was able to implement a lot of that into my own homeschooling. So we do a lot of interest-based, inquiry-based learning with my kids. We do a lot of play-based learning with my kids. I do a lot of movement and creativity, and we keep attention span blocks really short with my kids at home because there's only 2 of them. My kids aren't getting graded. We don't do EQA or standardized tests, so I'm not teaching to a test. I don't have to teach them how to take a standardized test because, by the way, that's the only way you can do well on a test. a standardized test is to be prepped and taught how to take it. We don't have to do that. And so I have this ability to take some of these really idealistic ideas that were taught in Teachers College, things like lots of movement and creativity, following kids' interests, keeping attention spans really short and keeping things moving and different and changing. I'm able to do that in my home with my kids. But it's just really not practical in a classroom setting. And unfortunately, like, that was a big thing that we did. Like, it was actually one of the reasons why we ended up starting our homeschooling journey, was because I just did not want my kids going through the chaos of the play-based kindergarten classroom that I was seeing in public schools and in private schools. I didn't want to see that, my kids go through that, because having experienced it and taught it, in my opinion, it was just chaos and craziness, and I just didn't want to do it. I didn't want to put them through that. So that's what started our homeschooling journey, and we've just decided never to go back. So in theory, I got a lot out of Teachers College. Methods was great. I got a lot of resources. I know how to set up a classroom. But really, 95% of what I learned in Teachers College does not apply to my homeschool room. Like I said, I was actually able to apply some of the idealism more so than any of the practical stuff that we learned. So in our homeschool, we keep the lessons short. We focus on having lots of breaks and focusing on the kids' short attention spans. We take a lot of creative liberties, and we do a lot of movement in our homeschooling. We follow what our kids are interested in, and we go on these deep dives, which was what, my professor Jeff wanted us to do, but it was just not practical to do in a big classroom. I'm able to do that with my 1 or 2 kids. The nice thing about what I learned in Teachers College is I'm actually able to apply these ideas to my homeschooling. But the question I think we need to ask is, did I need a degree to do that? No, because I just told you, keep your lessons short, lots of movement, follow their interests, and that was like 90% of what I learned in Teachers College. Like, there you go, boom, done. Obviously, Teachers College was great if I was going to stick in the public school system and if I was going to be teaching in that system. There was, like I said, methods, really practical, useful information. A lot of the resources that we did, really practical and useful things that I could actually take into a classroom when I was applying. Those are fantastic. They were great in the public school setting. That doesn't apply to your homeschool, because your homeschool is not school at home, right? That's not what you're doing. You're educating your children in your home through a variety of means, not just a very strict, very box type cookie cutter education that is what is being offered in public schools. That's what makes public school and homeschooling different. It's that ability to customize, to follow interests, to do what each child in your family needs versus what your kids are just expected to do because that's what someone higher up decided that they needed to do. Now, was there any negative aspects of me becoming a teacher and then trying to homeschool my kids? There was one, and I think this is a common thing for anybody who was a teacher and then ended up homeschooling. It's very common in that kind of like weird subsect, is that deschooling took a lot longer and it was a lot harder because not only were we raised in the education system, we were then taught how to maintain that education system and how to teach within that system. And so when you switch, it's a lot harder to turn that switch off. And so it did require a lot more deschooling. It did require a lot more like deprogramming in a sense for me to kind of break out and do homeschooling the way that I want to do it and the way that has been successful for us. I do think I had a bit of an easier time than most teachers that I've seen because of Jeff and Pam. Because I had these two specific teachers who were very into like inquiry based and very child centered, and like in that aspect, that idealism was something that I was able to kind of latch onto in my homeschooling. But I think if I hadn't had teachers who were unschoolers and who were kind of these like educational consultants in this like idealistic sense, if I didn't have those two specific teachers, I don't think I would have made such an easy deschooling. Like comparatively, I know a couple of teachers who are homeschooling and they struggle. They still to this day struggle despite homeschooling for a couple of years or being out of the system for a couple of years because it's so ingrained. And that is one thing that I am very thankful for, is that I wasn't in the school system very long, and that I had these two teachers whose idealism and ideas were still so fresh in my mind when we ended up starting our family and transitioning to homeschooling, that I was able to kind of make that jump a little bit easier than I think other teachers would have. But even still, it was still a pretty big jump from what I knew over to homeschooling. And so there are pros and cons, but I think at the end of this video, the thing I want you guys to get out of it is that what I learned in Teachers College, while interesting, while fascinating, while great for a public school system, was not going to really help me extensively when it came to homeschooling my own kids. And so you don't really need a teaching degree. I literally have given you all of the major lessons that have applied to my homeschooling from my teaching degree. They were not rocket science. I saved you a lot of money. You don't need to have a degree to homeschool your kids, because you're not maintaining the system. You're not setting, doing standardized testing. You're not following a strict curriculum that has been dictated by someone else. You are able to customize and move with your own kids, and that's pretty cool. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure you go down and subscribe and click the bell to know when we put out new videos, and make sure that you're following me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok so you can see what a teacher turned homeschool mom does on a regular basis. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.